Can I just ask about the dangers again? Because you were saying yesterday that it's not just about the physical danger, that it's more on a more psychological level that changes you as well. You were saying about witchcraft, I think.
I think one of the most interesting things about reading, anthropology always says you've got to make things strange. Either by going somewhere where you don't know anything, you don't know the language, you don't really know what's up or down, and you're like a child, you're made vulnerable. So most of us come from places where we're reasonably secure in the world. And you go to a place where suddenly people will treat you like an idiot, because you don't even know how to sit or how to eat or whatever. So that's a kind of... But the other side of it is, if we really take seriously the relativism of anthropology, is that what seems to you to be insane or crazy or irrational actually makes sense if you put it in its context. Something like witchcraft seems to us a sign of the primitive. But if you go into a community where people believe this, you realize it's not that different from a lot of what we do. We all read horoscopes, we all have a sense where we speculate, we all take risks, and so on. But beyond that, there's that fear of losing your grounding. You think you know more or less what's true in the world and what the bases are of the concepts that you hold to be real. And when you go to a place where people believe very fervently in things that to you are invisible, the ground begins to shift under your feet. And it can be a very enlightening thing, but it can also be terrifying. And one of the things I discovered when we went to do our field work first in South Africa, and there was this danger of living in an apartheid society with the police watching you, that people would say to us, we have to get a witch doctor, a healer, to protect you against the security police. We have to do this. And we would sort of laugh, my husband and I said, well, you've got to humour the natives kind of thing. By the time I left there, I was quite imbued with the fact that whether it was psychological or whatever, if I didn't have that treatment, I'd be vulnerable. And very often weird things happen, like the story I told last night, where you would be interviewing somebody and they'd say, this is really very secret knowledge about ancestors and our law, and we prefer it if you turn off the computer. And I'd like to pretend to turn off the computer, but I think there's nothing really incriminating here. Let me leave it on. And on 2 occasions, when I tried to play back the tape, there was like nothing on it. And my Tswana friends, my African friends, said, of course, the ancestors are powerful. They don't want to let you. They knew what you were doing. So there's a sense in which you don't quite believe them, but you don't disbelieve them either, because all of our truths are ultimately conventional, right? We believe in, do I know what actually gets the plane off the ground when the pilot, I don't, it's magic. I take it for granted that he knows, right? And so with much of the things you take to be true, you take on trust, you take them because they've always been that way, because people have reinforced them. When you live in a world where those things are true, they begin to be true for you. And when you come back, it's very unsettling. So I think those are, if you really take seriously the fact that what you try and do with anthropology is to make strange the things you assume, to hold them in suspension for a moment, and say, maybe there are other ways of thinking, right? There are other ways of, maybe our truths also come from where we are, rather than they are, God's sovereign truths and they will never change. When you go down that road, it can be unsettling, and many people find it too unsettling, and that's in a way what I was meaning.
I think just you might want to hear a little bit more about the current project. Maybe if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the transition in South Africa, and then I guess the criminal landscape or the detective landscape that's emerged from detectives to private security, even the questions about the occult that you raised.
Yeah. Look, I don't want this to sound too kind of, this is not only a matter of exotica. South Africa is interesting because it's a microcosm of things going on in many other places in the world. And in many ways, I'm going to argue in a talk later this afternoon, the South has now become the leading edge in what's unfolding in the world. You go to places like South Africa, there's a much going on in terms of very positive social experiments. It's not all about criminality and doom, right? It's a place where there's a very lively public sphere, where people understand the West better than we understand ourselves, because they've always had to, right? The journalism in South Africa, the quality of public debate is much better than I find in America. And often when I go back from there to America, I find I'm going back to the old country. I'm somewhere where people really have a sense that the future has to be theirs and they have to make something of it, right? So what is interesting is what these transitions mean. Places like South Africa are dramatic examples for us because they had a very radical transition. And it was the same in the USSR, right? And it's the same in parts of Latin America. Places where you have a regime change, ostensibly from an illegitimate pariah totalitarian society to one where there's new democracy and there's a new beginning and everybody's involved. And then the aftermath. Yeah? Because in fact, no experiment, no change of that kind ever achieves what it promises. But it is a change also. Yeah? And so the fascinating question is, can you invent a democracy from nothing? Can you take a racially divided colonial society and make a new kind of beginning? And what are the signs that you expect and what are the things that you don't expect? What we didn't expect was a criminal economy. What we also didn't expect was that a society that had always, in a sense, been ruled by difference. You know, colonial societies, the great British insight was divide and rule. In Britain, we were all unified, but in Africa, there was an emphasis on difference. And apartheid was based on the idea that everybody had their own ethnicity and culture, and they really should live separately, and it was a kind of hierarchy. So when the new South Africa happened, it was all about unification, generic citizenship, one language, and we were against the idea of culture and ethnicity. The whole idea was universal humanism, we are all citizens. Within 10 years, everybody was reasserting their right to be different. Why ethnicity? That's where ethnicity came from. Why do we want to be different in a world where we've been prejudiced against for being different? And people would argue, this is a different kind of difference. This is a form we choose. It's a kind we're proud of. It's a kind, what is more, that we can make even capital out of, because people are interested in our ways and our means, our special healing herbs, our whatever. So that was one aspect of the new project, is why do we live in a world that ostensibly is becoming more and more the same, more and more homogeneous, everybody going to McDonald's, everybody watching MTV, everybody Twittering, and yet at the same time, that same homogeneity seems to be producing difference. And it's a difference that people respond to often in an extraordinary way. We like born-again identitarians. Everybody in America now is a hyphenated American. People who left Ireland 2 generations ago are suddenly pouring back to more. People who were German Americans and lost their sense of ethnicity because they were never tribal ostensibly. Suddenly now they're learning German dances and they're putting on 19th century costumes. What is it? You go to England now and they're Morris dancing outside the pub. You know, it used to be that people from primitive places did folk dances. Now suddenly at the centre we do it. So it's a very interesting, that's another set of issues. And those are sort of the positive, quirky things that are happening. But the down, dark side of that is also that we were promised that this new world order, the triumph of the market system, the great development projects that you saw here in Ireland and that we saw in South Africa, liberalisation that came together with our liberty, and that has not delivered. It created an amazing kind of optimism and magical faith in the market of wealth, and now it's reaped a harvest of incredible, sort of loss, poverty, and marginalisation, and so on. And that has created that space between the promise of what was going to be delivered and the hard reality that, in fact, there still is a huge difference between rich and poor, that the rich will remain rich, but the poor now are paying for their folly, right? And these sorts of austerity cuts and the problems of insecurity that this has brought have been huge in places like that because people never really had prosperity. This was their moment when they were going to come into the sun. And they, in effect, have experienced very similar sorts of things to what's going on in Europe and in parts of Africa. And that has produced in Africa an impatience and an effort to say there's something uncanny working here. There's something mystical working here. And one response to it has been to say, the bankers stole from us. These rich people stole from us. So what is the difference between theft and property? And they sound like kind of organic Marxists. Why shouldn't we steal cars? Because we've never had them. And this is not crime, this is income redistribution. That's what it is. There's no income, and that's we're taking what should be ours. But another side of it is to say there's something mystical here. And it's not surprising that people in Wall Street and in the New York Times talk about voodoo economics and the magic of kind of zombie wealth and so on. We have this in South Africa too, and people are trying to work out why it is that the wealth goes in some places and not in others. What is the logic that unlocks this? And there's something unhealthy, almost immoral, not only immoral, but almost sort of cannibalistic about that kind of world. And those are also the sorts of things that we're interested in looking into. So in a way, it's just that I think anthropologists find in one place something which we hope has ramifications in many others. It's a way in which you see things that are worldwide, but in a particular case, and then you generalize from there, and that's what the project really